This is Jazz FM with the world's greatest jazz, soul and blues from the world's greatest artists.
Welcome to the Sarah Awards celebration here on Jazz FM. Just a few weeks ago, Sarah shared her decision to step back from regular broadcasting, to say goodbye for now and to hang up her headphones. I'm Chris Phillips, and it's been an honour to share studios and that infectious enthusiasm for music with Sarah during her time here at Jazz FM. And I'm thrilled to be hosting this very special programme where we'll explore some of her transmission tales. As many will attest, Sarah is a beautiful interviewer and loves to explore the adventures and creativity of others. But tonight, it's her turn. She's looking back on a career spanning 7 decades of innovative TV and radio success.
Do you know, it's been a long, long time, and my broadcasting life goes way back to Africa and travels the world, really. I've kind of seen myself as a bit of a broadcasting gypsy, travelling far and wide and just picking up new ways of doing things along the line. I've worked for the BBC, for BBC World Service in particular, and I've worked for Capital Radio. I've worked for a small commercial radio station called Victory in the southern part of the country. I've worked for British Forces Broadcasting Service. I've been there and I've been everywhere, really, sort of dipping my toes into radio waves and loving every moment.
We'll hear about her travels, musical discoveries and surprising encounters, including meeting with greats such as Oscar Peterson, Bob Dylan, Ray Charles and James Brown. And as we dip into different parts of Sarah's story, we'll be joined by fellow broadcasters along the way. But first, let's go back to early radio days for Sarah, to the very beginning in Kenya.
That's where it all started for me, and it started with a snake. It did, honestly, because I was sort of guided by my beloved mother into applying for a job at British Forces Broadcasting Service. I'd never thought about being a broadcaster, but she said, go on, have a go. So I did, and I got a job as a sort of, let's let her kind of do anything, really. She can sweep the floor, she can do this, she can do that, but we'll allow her to do a bit of broadcasting. So on my very first day of broadcasting, it was very early in the morning, they decided to give me a morning dawn shift. I walked into the studio, and what did I see but wrapped around the microphone? A snake! I'm terrified of them. And I was about to scream when I noticed that it was a snake's skin, because they shed their skins, and it was a joke, of course, a little laugh. It took me into wonderful days in Africa. It was such a fascinating time for me. I have some lovely memories. I later went to work for the Voice of Kenya, where I just established very special relationships with some great African colleagues. Giraffe was the head of the English language department that I was working for, called Giraffe because he was enormously tall. And these people were just, so fresh and useful and full of excitement, because Kenya was moving into a new era. I was there for independence, and I was actually broadcasting live on the day that the flag came down. I have to say, it was the Union Jack, of course, and Uhuru was declared, and it was such a time. There were huge crowds everywhere, totally peaceful. I was broadcasting live with a beauty contest, and I went out to join the crowds then. The feeling of joy just literally tingled through my body and everybody else's. We just shuffled around, we danced, we sang, and later, when I had to sadly decided to leave Kenya because I was moving over to make room for many others, my African colleagues spent the last of my nights in Nairobi with me. It was a party, but it was a very gentle, reflective one. We just talked to each other a bit about politics, but mostly just about us, about who we were, why we'd come together and enjoyed each other so much. And it was full of love and warmth. And they took me to the airport. They saw me off. And it's a memory that I just have in my heart forever. It was Africa for me. Wonderful people. Great, great memories from that time. And as I left Africa, part of what I carried with me was all the music that I'd heard there. The beat of the street, the beat in the country, the beat everywhere you went, there was music. And I first heard the great Miriam Makeba as part of the Black Bears, a troupe of singers sent out from the dreaded apartheid days in South Africa. But her voice was ringing out for freedom, as indeed it went on to do later. And it was where I first touched base with people like Fela Kuti, the marvellous Nigerian revolutionary, with the hottest, most brilliant jazz you're likely to hear anywhere. And it's where my love of music really flourished and sprang into real life. It was Africa that gave me the beat in my feet. Although I hit the UK in freezing cold winter, and that was a startling shock. And that was when I decided that this broadcasting life was something I really would like to hang on to if I possibly could. And my first big audition was for the BBC, funnily enough, to be an announcer. And I told a dreadful, rambling story about elephants, thinking as I was telling it, this is crazy. But actually they liked it, and I got the job. So there I was at the BBC as an announcer, first of all. Then I went on to present Junior Points of View, which is a joy. It was just children's letters about what they loved and hated about television. That was tremendously good fun. And at the BBC too, I had some great encounters with people, including Bob Dylan. Really, I met him. Nobody believes this, but I did. I'd seen him in a concert at the BBC. Didn't really know who he was, although people were beginning to say he is just the coming thing. He's going to be huge. But I saw him in this concert and he was just sitting on a little stool and I was taken by him. I thought, he's magic. There's something very special about him. Later on, as an announcer, we used to do little late-night interviews. He was brought into the studio to talk to me about something he was going to do on BBC Two, which had newly arrived. And he sat there and I tried to talk to him and he wouldn't. Really. He smiled a bit and then he took a biscuit out of his coat pocket and waved it in front of me and said, "This is a BBC biscuit." And that was all I could get out of him. I couldn't get stories about music or about how he felt about his increasing kind of fame arriving. Nothing. Just BBC biscuits. So that's one to tuck away in the memory bag.
It's Jazz FM, and we're celebrating the pioneering broadcaster, our colleague Sarah Ward. As we've heard, it hasn't always been the comfort of a radio studio for Sarah. Her UK career began as a television host, and it wasn't without its challenges.
TV was a completely new experience for me, I have to say, and I was really terrified. I didn't quite know how to cope with it at all, and beloved Liz Cowley was the helping hand. She just pushed me and said, "Go on, do it." One of the things I did for Liz, I wouldn't have done it for anybody else, was to do a parachute jump. for the programme Come Hereafter. And that was astonishing. I was terrified. And it was in Devon. And my mother was standing by with tranquilizers and wondering what on earth I'd got myself into. But it just worked. It was great. When I actually jumped out of the plane and eventually landed with my parachute, I actually almost landed on a young couple who were kissing and cuddling. And they ran. They were scattered, running. But we all laughed. It was a tremendous memory. And I had just a feeling for being afraid of television, but it was also a very broadening experience because, again, you had to think of different things. You had to think an awful lot about what you were wearing, what you looked like, but there were always, again, these strange encounters. When I was working with Liz, in our next door studio, most of Monty Python were gathered, and that was in early days, before they became Monty Python's Flying Circus. It was in the days when people like John Cleese and Michael Palin and those people were getting together doing all sorts of comedic things. And they would poke their head through our studio door and say hello. So it was very friendly. So although I was frightened of television, there was a lot of warmth actually amongst people working in this medium, and a lot of friendliness that I carry with me to this day. Long ago, gosh, I can barely remember it now, but I do remember the warmth. I certainly do.
Sarah's creativity has always been one of her greatest strengths, and that approach of thinking outside the box alongside a heavy dose of determination and resilience is how she became part of the industry-leading team who launched Capital Radio, one of Britain's first 2 commercial radio stations.
Funky Capital, London, can you dig it? Funky Capital, London, can you dig it?
Now, I left the BBC and wondered where to go next after auditioning and being a continuity announcer, loving that, having some glorious times at the BBC. But I thought I was hearing stories about this emerging commercial radio station, Capital Radio Station. It was actually being built in the heart of London at that time. And somebody said to me, just go and see if there's any job there. So I did. I stumbled off the streets outside the newly emerging Capital Radio. I forget exactly where it was then. It was long before it moved to its stately other homes later. But there was this huge man who I later came to know and love as Michael Brecht, shouting a lot at people. He did that. And doing everything, really. And there was rubber all over the place and people were jumping up and down. It was very exciting. I walked in. He said, "Who are you?" I gave my name, rather shakily, and I changed it to just Sarah Ward by then. It had been Sarah Corbett Ward, but I changed it to Sarah Ward at the BBC. And he said, "Well, what do you want?" I said, "I think I want a job." And he said, "OK, what can you do?" He took me over to a huge console, which was a kind of a DJ deck. He said, "Do you know how to use this?" I said, "No, I have no idea." Sat me down in front of it and taught me how to be a DJ. That was the start of my Capital Radio days, and they were heavenly. I just remember them with such excitement, really. It was a thrilling time to be there, to be in radio with the birth of commercial radio. LBC had got there first, I think, but Capital Radio following hot on the heels. And it was there that I met so many extraordinary people.
Wow, I feel good. I knew that I wouldn't.
And later there were some other encounters. Sir James Brown clasped me to his bosom and called me Sister Sarah because he'd heard that I'd been living in Africa and was actually born there. I went to interview Ray Charles, and a rather mischievous presenter who was in the long queue to go up and meet Ray Charles said to me, "Oh gosh, he's frightening. You're going to be terrified. He's in a dreadful mood." I was trembling. I didn't really know what I was going to say to him, what I was going to ask him. And I went upstairs and he turned out to be absolutely lovely. He was just warm and friendly and perfect. And another terrific encounter was with Oscar Peterson. Again, I was going to do an interview and always trying to prepare myself, but always being a little bit nervous because I'd had no real training in interviewing at all. So I just had to work off intuition in a way. And I got into this room in a big hotel in London to talk to Oscar. And he was just lovely. But he could see that I was very nervous. I was actually shaking. So I was using a Ewer. We used those in those days, ancient broadcasting, recording equipment, clumsy, quite difficult to use. He could see I was having trouble. He said, "Look, I've got one of those at home. I'll take it and I'll twiddle the knobs," which he did. So he recorded his interview with me. Lovely moment. One I absolutely adored.
So nice that I got you. Wow, I feel good.
Actually, Capital Radio was stacked with wonderful colleagues. It was a very special time. Lynn Parsons, I have to give a special thought to as well, because she and I worked in adjoining studios at Capital Radio at one time when it was Capital Gold and then Capital, and Lynn was doing the Capital bit and I was doing the Capital Gold bit. So we would be always meeting at about 5 or 6 in the morning, both doing overnight shifts, where we would hug each other, have a coffee and just settle down, remember some of the better moments during the night.
Hello, I'm Lynn Parsons, currently at Magic in the Evenings. Sarah and I crossed paths when I was the newbie at Capital Radio back in the late 80s. We were both doing late shows and shared an office in the music department at the famous Euston Tower. There were glass walls and a door to the office, which I vividly remember we had to keep closed because we laughed a lot. We hit it off immediately as we're fellow Cancerians. On air, Sarah is exactly the same as off air, warm and friendly and welcoming. Yes, the voice is honey-toned, but Sarah's knowledge of music is extraordinary. So it's the combination of those two things and a third ingredient. Sarah is a natural broadcaster. I've learned so much from her, particularly on Jazz Travels, and she's cost me a considerable amount of money over the years with the artists she's introduced me to, but it's been worth it. I shall miss your show, Sarah, sending all the love in the world.
Hello, I'm Nicky Horn. I first met Sarah Ward at Capital Radio. It was in September 1973, and I remember a couple of days before we went on the air, all this kind of chaos around us as the engineers were desperately trying to get this thing on the air. Sarah had this kind of serenity about her, this kind of calmness. You know, when Sarah was around, you knew that everything was going to be okay. And Michael Butt gave me my first program, which was a daily show, a rock show called Your Mother Wouldn't Like It. And I remember the producer of the program was a guy called Gary Beard. And we both agreed that we wanted a female voice. And so we talked to Sarah about doing a regular review spot on Your Mother Wouldn't Like It. And Sarah became part of the show. Every week she would review albums. And Sarah, back then, Sarah, let me tell you, was a bit of a rock chick. And she loved her rock music. And she was a wonderful addition to the show. I always loved hearing Sarah on the air because I knew that I was listening to someone who was completely authentic. and the quality of Sarah's voice. Sarah has this incredible warmth and roundness to her voice, but there's always just a little element of danger. You never quite know exactly what she's going to say, and that's just such a wonderful quality.
And we'll continue to hear from Sarah's colleagues from across the years, including Mark Kermode, who credits his start in radio to Sarah. And Jez Nelson shares how she invited him and me onto her Radio 5 morning show. It's Chris Phillips here on Jazz FM, celebrating the talent, dedication and warmth of broadcaster Sarah Ward as she steps back from regular presenting after a career spanning 7 decades. More brilliant memories to come, including stories of meeting Muhammad Ali, travels across the world, and of course, Sarah's time with us here at Jazz FM.
Make Jazz FM your New Year's Eve soundtrack with John Osborne, Lady Blackbird and Robbie Vincent in the run-up to the Big Ben chimes. And then Dom Savini with an acid jazz mixtape. Followed by Ruanki's Afterglow into the small hours. It all starts from 6 and commercial free from 7. Here on Jazz FM. This is Jazz FM.
It's Jazz FM and a very special programme this evening as we honour Sarah Ward after she's decided to hang up her headphones and step back from regular broadcasting. I'm Chris Phillips and I'm chuffed to be guiding you through Sarah's tales and reflections of a fascinating career. So let's continue to immerse ourselves in Sarah's brilliance. Here are some more of her utterly unique memories.
I've met so many people and I've just loved that. That's been one of the most important parts of the job really for me. I don't think of it as a job actually, it's pure pleasure. Just talking to people, picking up stories, going to different cultures actually, dipping in, finding out more about them and just hearing so much about other people's lives and histories and special moments. That's been a special pleasure in the whole of my broadcasting life. Conversations across the world, here in the UK and in the various radio stations that I've worked for over all these decades. It's been magical. Talking about those days at Capital Radio, there were some extraordinary encounters. One that was very moving was walking down Capital Radio's main corridor, moved to a much bigger, smarter building by now, and was very much on the scene and part of the radio landscape. And I was walking down this big corridor with Muhammad Ali. Better believe it. He had about, it seemed like 20 henchmen with him, but in fact it was probably a couple. They looked quite stern. But Muhammad Ali was kind of strange. He was very ill at this time, in fact. There was still a spark there. And he walked beside me, and there was a kind of warmth from him. We had a kind of interview, bit of a conversation. It was a bit stumbly, but I just felt a warmth and a sort of tenderness from him that was something very special. Because this man, of course, had been this huge star, not only in boxing, but a political star as well. And here he was, and I just got from him warmth and great courtesy, not to be forgotten.
It's Chris Phillips with the Sarah Ward celebration on Jazz FM. We're thrilled that before she says goodbye to hosting weekly shows here on Jazz FM, she's taken the time to share her transmission tales of TV and radio days here in the UK and further afield as well.
I always wanted to explore the world. Not surprising, really, as it all started for me in Nairobi, Kenya, in Africa. So I was always wanting to find out more about other countries and other places. And luckily, during my career, I was able to do just that. One of the trips that I took was to Jamaica, and there I met Rita Marley, who was gracious and beautiful and showed me around the shrine, the studio really, where the great Bob had made a lot of his music, and told me lovely stories about him, and was just a very graceful hostess. I really, really enjoyed that meeting, I can tell you.
As Sarah's taken us to Jamaica, it's the perfect moment to dip into her time at the BBC World Service. From March 1988, here she is talking to Ms. Lou in a special edition of Sarah and Company.
And now, from the BBC in London, it's Sarah and Company with Sarah Ward.
Hello again. This week, Sarah and Company's in the Caribbean, and here's Louise Bennett with a warm welcome to a special Jamaican edition of the programme. Perhaps you could help me and give me a little lesson to understand something. We've had a song that in Britain certainly has been a very big hit, and I believe it's been a big hit by the same group called Musical Youth in Jamaica, we called it in Britain Past the Duchy. Now this is an old song, isn't it? We thought it was brand new at the time. What's its history?
In Jamaica, it got popular under the thing of Past the Duchy. But this is an old Rasta thing that they used to use in a sort of ritual. I knew this many, many years ago when I was doing social work and was really collecting folk songs and so on. You would go to a group and they would do this. They say, no difference here, no difference here. You pass the kutchip on the left-hand side, no difference here. Me say you pass the kutchip on the left-hand side, no difference here. And this was the thing, and this came from na 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 da 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 da, which is a Kabaka tune, and it comes from the same root, the same song, which the last one I did was Mento, the middle one was Poco, and that is this was Rasta, and now it is a reggae.
Sounds like a very special meeting between Sarah and Ms. Lou. And we go from Jamaica to South Africa.
So I had lots of lovely travelling experiences. Jamaica was tremendous, and Africa was always in my heart. I went back to Africa quite a few times, to South Africa at the very end of just as apartheid was disappearing and the whole country was alive and changing, and there was such a atmosphere there. And when Nick Reynolds, one of my favourite producers of all time at BBC World Service, he and I were together on this trip. We arrived at Johannesburg Airport, and getting off a plane, I think he was getting on a plane, we were getting off ours, was the great Ibrahim Abdullah.
My name is Nick Reynolds. I first met Sarah when I was a music producer at BBC World Service. Sarah was always a great presenter because she was always enthusiastic, always able to be positive about whatever it was that I was throwing at her to talk about. She very, very rarely said anything about something that she might not have liked, but so she was always positive, always up for it, always willing to sort of take a chance. She was a fantastic interviewer. She knew how to put people at their ease. She knew how to make them communicate, because Sarah was able to charm anyone, really. She was great at interviewing people and getting them to talk. And we were able to go on 2 duty trips, as they were called in those days, because in those days the World Service was still a slightly imperial kind of colonial kind of place. So you would go on a duty trip as though it was your duty to fly out somewhere around the world and tell people about World Service or whatever. So I have very fond memories of Sarah. She's a lovely human being. I hope that her future is very bright. I know that she has loved working at Jazz FM because her first love is jazz, and she's a real aficionado and a real expert on it. She has all the very best from me because we had some fantastic adventures together.
We met loads of youngsters because that was part of the reason of why we were there, meeting the youngsters getting ready for the new South Africa. I talked to loads of them, I engaged with them and just felt so privileged actually to be part of this great change in that part of the great continent of Africa. South Africa throwing off the yokel of apartheid and becoming alive and something else. It was, well, what can I say? I feel quite sort of trembly when I think about it, actually. So special.
And that passion for sharing stories and getting people involved in her programs never changed. Here at Jazz FM, she spent a decade hosting Jazz Travels, taking us around the world and showcasing that undeniable love for the music. And if you go to Rayo and jazzfm.com, you can find a special edition of Jazz Travels hosted by Ruan Geese with a heap of archive interviews from Sarah's tenure. A very special listen. But for now, we're going to stay in Sarah's BBC days, where she again found herself involved in the very beginnings of a radio station.
Thank you for calling the Radio 5 Talkback service. Please leave your message after the tone.
I've heard about surprise peas. They're absolutely crazy. They'll be at it again tomorrow, prodding some peas. This is Morning Edition. Sarah Ward and John Briggs setting the agenda for today, Wednesday, the 29th of August.
I had so many lovely times at the BBC and ended up having a really unusual time at the beginning of 5 Live. It was when it was in its experimental stages, and there were a whole bunch of us gathered together to broadcast programmes that were sort of giving a flavour of what 5 Live might become eventually. And we had a lot of fun. It was a celebration really of youth in many ways, because I was still quite young then, and I was surrounded by brilliant youngsters who were going places, and we just enjoyed inventing something. That's what we did. And people came and went. We had a newspaper review on the programme that I co-hosted with John Briggs, and people came and went doing the newspaper review. Chris Phillips I dragged in once to do the newspapers. He was terrific. He was wearing a hippie hat and he had very much his jazz persona on his head. But I think we had somebody as famous. I think David Attenborough was a guest once doing newspapers for us, and all sorts of lovely people like that used to come in. So, and we had a lot of fun because we weren't being kind of heavily supervised, but we were all involved in kind of creating something that was going to go on and become something that was a new branch of the BBC.
Hi, this is Mark Kermode. I'm a film critic and broadcaster, and I'm delighted to have been asked to contribute to this programme, not least because I love Sarah Ward, I love radio programmes, and I pretty much owe Sarah my broadcasting career, because if I remember correctly, around about 1994, I got a phone call. I was just a freelance journalist. I was just sort of picking up jobs wherever I could. And I got a phone call from Sarah. We had done a little bit of work together on a radio station. I think I was reviewing videos like once a month or something. I got a phone call from Sarah. Said, "Hi Mark, it's Sarah Ward. Do you want to be the film critic on BBC Radio 5? And I remember saying, well, there isn't a BBC Radio 5. It only goes up to 4. And she said, no, there is, or at least there is now. And I'm presenting the morning shows, Sarah and John Briggs, two brilliant voices in the studio together. She said, we need a film critic, and I thought you'd be good for it, so would you like to do it? And I said, okay, but when? And as I remember, Sarah said, Wednesday? And that was that. Like, in a phone call, my entire life changed. And suddenly I was the weekly film critic on a national radio station simply because Sarah had asked me to do it. And, of course, the experience was absolutely brilliant. I loved that programme. Anyone who's a fan of Sarah's programmes will know that she has just the most fantastic voice, and her knowledge of music and jazz in particular is so all-encompassing. My dad was a huge jazz fan, and I'd grown up in a household which was full of jazz records, but it was just great being, with Sarah, because she's got such a great broadcasting voice, and because her knowledge of jazz music was so evident, and her passion for it. I mean, I've always felt I'm very passionate about films, but I love how much she loved and knew about music. And more importantly than that, she was just like really welcoming. I mean, she was really a very well-established broadcaster, and I was just some, as I said, some fly-by-night freelancer, and our paths had happened to cross. And she just happened to think, well, he'd probably be okay, he could get away with it. And honestly, I don't think she had any good reason to believe that other than instinct. So, Sarah, a fabulous career and a fabulous voice, and all your listeners will be, they'll know how marvellous it is to listen to you. But I'm just here to say what a pleasure it was to work with you. And you were so welcoming, and you looked after me so well. And I'm still doing this after all these years because you gave me the chance to do it. So thanks very much.
Now, Sarah mentioned that she dragged me into the Radio 5 studio, and I wasn't alone. Jez Nelson was with me. I'll let him tell the story and share what makes Sarah so special.
She has been a fixture for me as a broadcaster throughout my listening years. I began listening to Capital Radio as a young boy, and she was there. And then, of course, she was on the BBC, and now for many years here at Jazz FM. And I think she's an absolute sort of pioneer, really, of broadcasting, full stop. And if you think about it, there she was on Capital Radio and then on the BBC, the very definition of a professional journalist and broadcaster with a really kind of warm and open and modern presentation technique. I think if you think about broadcasters that have come after her, like Jane Garvey and Rachel Burden, I think that Sarah is the model really for that, and so she's an incredible broadcaster. So she's been there for me throughout my listening career. And then the other thing is, it was amazing that when Chris Phillips and I were on Jazz FM in 1991, after we were, let's say, let go, because we played too much jazz back on Jazz FM back in those days, Sarah called us up and asked her to go on and be guests on her breakfast show on BBC Radio 5. And Chris and I would go on in the mornings at about 8 o'clock in the morning, and she would ask us to play extracts of her favourite jazz recordings at that moment. I have a memory of playing Steve Coleman on Radio 5 at 8 a.m. in the morning, and I'll tell you what, it meant so much because, we were a bit down in the dumps after we left Jazz FM. It meant so much that a broadcaster of Sarah's stature had reached out to us, and she really did it as an act of support, I think. I mean, she might have wanted us on the show, but I think she did it as an act of support. And, this was an age when not all of the older generation of broadcasters were supportive of us. They thought we were kind of upstarts. And the fact that Sarah not only embraced us as broadcasters, but also embraced our passion for jazz. She was so open-minded, and to this day is still so open-minded about the music. If you listen to her shows right up to date, she's playing, contemporary music. And it was so exciting for us and so meaningful to us that there was a broadcaster of her weight and her excellence that kind of recognised something in us and supported us. So thank you, Sarah. That was an important little step in my broadcasting career. You're a wonderful broadcaster. You've got great taste in music. I wish you well for the future.
I'm sure we're not the only ones who have immense gratitude for Sarah Ward. That passion and support for the music and culture is clear for everyone to hear. Right up until her last Sarah Ward collection that was on earlier this evening here on Jazz FM. I'm Chris Phillips, and soon we'll continue our celebration of this pioneering radio presenter as she's decided to step back from regular broadcasting. We span many decades on this programme, and we'll close with reflections of Sarah's time here at Jazz FM.
Jazz FM.
We're celebrating the beloved broadcasting legend that is Sarah Ward in this very special programme that's followed her final Sarah Ward collection show earlier this evening. From rock to pop, classical to Afrobeat, Sarah's love of the music and culture has fueled her programmes, be it at Capital Radio, Classic FM, BBC World Service, or of course here at Jazz FM. But there's been a passion for jazz the whole way through, so it's very fitting that she spent many years, the latter part of her career, sharing her love of artists like Charles Mingus, Thelonious Monk, Norma Winstone, Fela Kuti, and many, many more with us on Jazz FM.
I can remember hearing Jazz FM long before I actually joined this lovely family. And it was listening to Jez Nelson and Chris Phillips, of course, and they were doing this fantastic drive-in show that was wild, crazy and mad. And Ken and I, that's Ken, my saxophone playing partner, and I used to listen to it as we were driving out of London, heading back to home, way outside. And I fell in love with Jazz FM then, joined later and got to meet these wonderful people. Jez had gone on to do other things. Chris was there, and the wonderful Helen Mayhew, who led me into dinner jazz and gave me support and love and happy memories. So it was a wonderful time. One of the most special people that I encountered again was the wonderful P.Y., no longer with us, Peter Young, but such a celebrated figure in music. He actually had a passion, which he shared, I know, with listeners, and he shared it with people like me too. And I'd met him first at Capital Radio. He was the person who kind of looked after me, really, because I was doing these overnight shows as a disc jockey, and I didn't really know how to be a disc jockey. And PY, with great humour, a wry sort of humour, led me into that whole world, and also helped me to just fall more and more in love with music. He really did. So he is there with me in spirit, always, always. I'll never ever forget PY, a special person in my life. And Rosie Kendrick was a very special person in my life then, because she was a producer at Jazz FM. And she and I sat down one day and decided that we'd like to do a programme that took us outside of the UK to the rest of the world. Jazz Travels was born. And our idea really was to collect music and stories from all over the world and put them together in a programme. And we set about it, and it worked. It was wonderful. And we met some amazing people, and I was just thrilled that so many fabulous women were emerging, doing great things and playing unusual and extraordinary instruments as well in many different parts of the world. A few of them just stay in my mind forever. Sona Kubate, who was the first woman to take that lovely West African choral harp out into the world. And then there was the wonderful Maya Yusuf, who lives in the UK now. And you may have heard her because she plays concerts all over the country. But she was in Syria then, and she decided she wanted to play the quanoon, which is a huge kind of instrument, very special to Syria. People thought she was mad, but she got ahead and decided to do it. And so she did, and played it absolutely brilliantly. I remember meeting the great Angelique Kidjo as well. Wonderful activist, somebody who's just spread warmth and empowerment throughout the world. So women were very much in the frame, doing great things. And Bex Birch, I mustn't forget her, because she built her own instrument, which was the guil from northern Ghana, herself, having spent some time in that part of the country, northern part of Ghana, learning about ancestry, about language, about history, about all sorts of things, and how to build this amazing instrument made of wood. So those are the stories I absolutely treasure from those early days of jazz travels. And of course, one of my special moments was coming face to face with Hugh Masekela. And we were celebrating his life and times on Jazz FM. And he was just a hoot. He was terrific. He burst out singing during the course of our interview, and he just told me great stories of how he and many others managed to survive the dreaded apartheid in South Africa. They just did their own thing. He reminded me, as a young boy, he used to just run around with friends, and they somehow made a life that wasn't overshadowed by this dreadful thing that was hanging over them. So Hugh is one of my magical memories, and I'll just never forget him. I've got a photograph of him, actually, and it's stuck to the wall. So he's there as a constant memory. When then did the trumpet attract you as an instrument? Was that accidental, Hugh, or was it just part of growing up?
I loved it, watching, from afar. I mean, everybody loved Louis Armstrong when we were kids, and we used to, we loved Louis Armstrong, loved the way, you could sing along with Louis Armstrong. And when he sang, nobody sang as happily as he did. He made every song just be like a rose garden of sounds and smiles. And he never lost his childish, the child in him. And he told me that later on. He said, you lose the child, you're finished. But I grew up with the bands of the Duke Ellington, so I knew everybody. I knew, the Cat Hendersons and the Clark Terrys and all that, and the Count Basie band, and then there was like the Glenn Miller bands, and Frank Sinatra came out of the Pied Pipers and the Tommy Dorsey band. So I was like a scholar of music from when I was very little, but we knew the songs of like Fats Domino and Red Foley, all the Andrews Sisters songs. I can sing you any one of them right
Go
now.
on, let's hear one.
But my favorite song as a kid, I had an uncle who was a record collector, was like maybe 10 years older than me, and he had a gramophone, and we'd sing together. But the two favorite songs I used to sing with him was the Chattanooga Choo Choo. Pardon me, boy, is that the Chattanooga Choo Choo? Yeah, track 29. Why don't you choo-choo me home, right? Meet me at the station at 1:45. Dinner in the diner, nothing would be finer than to have a ham and eggs and carrot line. Check it.
I love it.
So I didn't know what I was singing about when I was a kid. And I got a girl where in Kalamazoo, don't want to boast because I know she's
And Jazz FM, of course, is where my heart has been in much more recent years. And it's also a way of just looking back and remembering how the recording environment has changed completely and utterly. Going back to my early years, carrying a heavy Ewer recording machine around, we did an awful lot of live broadcasting all over the place. And now it's all completely different. You can do an awful lot more in different ways from wherever you are. And my little studio now is on the very edge of Dartmoor, where I have owls flying about at night, and I have a friendly pheasant who has sort of grown to love us very much and comes and asks for food. So a very different environment, and it's the way radio has changed dramatically. I've seen an awful lot of it, and it has been such a very great pleasure and privilege to be there. And as I sort of wend my way gently out of Jazz FM, I must specially say thank you to everybody who's ever listened to me. Bless you. Thanks. I've loved your company. And I must say a huge thank you to Nick Pitts now, who is our station manager and content director. Nick and I first met years ago, so we're old friends. We go back a long way, and it's so lovely to have been part of Nick embracing Jazz FM in more recent years. It's been a whirl. It's been a ball. I've loved every moment.
No, it's a nice, nice place to be. I can't forget. Hey. Under the mango tree, I can't forget. No, under the mango tree.
What an honour to have Sarah Ward as part of Jazz FM's legacy. She's loved every moment, and we're thrilled that she's blessed us with countless exquisite playlists, captivating conversations, and so much warmth. And speaking for myself, I've always looked up to Sarah. What a broadcaster. That unbelievable enthusiasm and passion for the music. From Nairobi to London and beyond, the BBC to commercial, TV to radio. It's been a pleasure to explore all these elements of Sarah's immense broadcasting journey, a fascinating career that spans 7 decades. We wish her and her partner Ken all the very best. All of us here at Jazz FM send our love and gratitude to you, Sarah, in Dartmoor. And if you didn't catch the final Sarah Ward collection earlier this evening, then you can listen through jazzfm.com or the Rayo app. Next up, it's a special classics edition of The Blueprint until midnight here on Jazz FM with me, Chris Phillips.